The elevator doors slid shut with a soft chime that sounded like a funeral bell, sealing my fate as I stood clutching the cardboard box containing 3 years of my professional life. My hands trembled as I pressed the button for the parking garage, watching the numbers descend just like my career had in the span of a single, devastating morning. Through the polished steel reflection, I could see mascara-stained tracks down my cheeks and the hollow expression of someone who just watched their entire world collapse because of nepotism, betrayal, and the calculated cruelty of privilege that I'd been naive enough to think wouldn't touch me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Just 2 hours ago, I'd been Madison Clarke, Senior Account Executive at Meridian Marketing Group, the woman who'd just secured the biggest client in the company's history. Now I was just another casualty of corporate politics, carrying my personal belongings in a box that felt heavier with each floor we descended, knowing that upstairs, Victoria Ashford was probably already redecorating the office that should have been mine, celebrating a promotion she'd stolen rather than earned. But what Victoria Ashford and her father, CEO Richard Ashford, couldn't possibly have known as they orchestrated my professional execution, was that in exactly 6 hours, I would be sitting across from their biggest nightmare in the penthouse office of Clarke Industries, learning that the woman they'd just discarded like yesterday's coffee wasn't just Madison Clarke, marketing executive. She was Madison Clarke, granddaughter of the legendary Helena Clarke, whose business empire was about to make their little marketing firm look like a lemonade stand. And the client they thought they'd secured by replacing me? Phoenix Dynamics Corporation was about to discover exactly why loyalty matters in business, and why underestimating a Clarke had historically been the last mistake their competitors ever made. 6 hours earlier, I'd walked into Meridian Marketing Group's gleaming downtown headquarters, with the confidence of someone who'd just pulled off the impossible. My navy blazer was perfectly pressed, my portfolio leather case contained the signed contracts that would change everything, and my step had the bounce of someone who knew she was about to deliver news that would transform not just her career, but the entire trajectory of the company she'd devoted 3 years of her life to building. The Phoenix Dynamics deal had been my white whale for 8 months, a $50 million account that every marketing firm in the city had been chasing, with the desperation of sharks scenting blood in the water. Phoenix was expanding their renewable energy operations nationwide and needed a marketing partner who could handle the complexity of their technical messaging while appealing to both corporate clients and environmentally conscious consumers. It was the kind of account that made careers, the kind of victory that separated the truly exceptional account executives from the merely competent ones. I'd spent countless evenings researching Phoenix's corporate culture, studying their executive team's backgrounds, and crafting presentations that spoke directly to their vision of sustainable energy leadership. I'd sacrificed weekends, missed family dinners, and turned down social invitations, because I believed that hard work and expertise would be rewarded with the recognition I'd earned. The naive optimism of someone who still believed that merit mattered more than last names and sorority connections. The presentation had gone flawlessly. Phoenix's marketing director, James Morrison, had listened with the kind of focused attention that told me I was hitting every mark. Their sustainability coordinator had nodded approvingly at my environmental messaging strategy. Most importantly, their CEO, Dr. Sarah Chen, had asked the kind of detailed questions that indicated genuine interest rather than polite obligation. When they'd asked for a formal proposal, I'd known with the certainty of someone who'd read the room perfectly that Phoenix Dynamics was going to be mine. 3 weeks of 16-hour days had followed, crafting a proposal that was nothing short of brilliant. I'd identified market gaps their previous campaigns had missed, developed messaging frameworks that balanced technical credibility with emotional appeal, and created implementation timelines that were both ambitious and achievable. The proposal was 127 pages of strategic excellence, backed by market research that had cost me nearly $1,000 of my own money to commission, because I'd known that winning Phoenix would be worth any personal investment. Yesterday morning, Dr. Chen had called personally to deliver the news that Meridian Marketing Group had been selected as Phoenix Dynamics' exclusive marketing partner. The relief and euphoria had been overwhelming, validation that my instincts, my strategy, and my relentless work ethic had combined to achieve something extraordinary. I'd immediately called Victoria Ashford to share the news, expecting congratulations from someone I'd foolishly considered a friend, despite the growing tension between us over the past few months. Victoria's response had been enthusiastic enough, all the right words delivered with what I'd interpreted as genuine excitement. She'd insisted on scheduling an immediate meeting with her father to discuss the Phoenix victory and what it meant for our department's expansion. I'd agreed eagerly, imagining the promotion conversation that was surely coming, the corner office that would finally match my contributions, and the salary increase that would justify all the personal sacrifices I'd made for Meridian's success. Walking into Richard Ashford's corner office that morning, I'd felt the confidence of someone who'd just delivered a victory that would reshape the company's entire financial trajectory. The Phoenix contract represented more than a marketing account. It was validation of the strategic vision I'd been advocating for months, proof that my unconventional approaches to client acquisition were not just effective, but transformative. Richard Ashford had greeted me with the kind of smile that I'd learned to interpret as approval, the expression of a CEO who recognized valuable talent when he saw it. His office reflected the success of someone who'd built Meridian from a small boutique firm into one of the city's most respected marketing agencies, all polished wood and strategic awards that spoke to decades of business acumen. I'd settled into the leather chair across from his desk, my portfolio case containing the signed Phoenix contracts resting confidently in my lap. "Madison," he'd begun, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone delivering important news. "What you've accomplished with Phoenix Dynamics is truly remarkable. It's exactly the kind of strategic victory that demonstrates why Meridian has become the region's premier marketing firm." The praise had felt like validation, after months of watching less qualified colleagues receive recognition, while my contributions were acknowledged with polite nods rather than professional advancement. I'd worked harder than anyone else in the department, consistently exceeded my targets, and brought innovative strategies that had improved client satisfaction across multiple accounts. Phoenix was simply the culmination of excellence that had been building for years. "Thank you, Richard," I'd replied, feeling the satisfaction of someone whose work was finally being recognized at the executive level. Phoenix represents exactly the kind of forward-thinking partnership that aligns with Meridian's commitment to innovation. I believe this account will serve as a model for how we approach similar opportunities in the sustainable technology sector. But something in Richard's expression had shifted subtly, a barely perceptible change that should have warned me that this conversation wasn't following the trajectory I'd anticipated. His smile had become more formal, more distant, carrying the kind of professional courtesy that preceded difficult news rather than celebration.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
"That's exactly why I wanted to discuss Phoenix with you personally," he'd continued, his tone taking on the measured cadence of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation. "This account represents a significant expansion of our capabilities, the kind of high-profile partnership that requires our most experienced leadership to ensure flawless execution." The words had begun to feel wrong, though I hadn't yet understood why. Phoenix was my account, secured through my relationships, my strategy, and my relentless pursuit of a client that no one else had been able to land. The suggestion that it required different leadership seemed to contradict everything about how I'd won the business in the first place. "I agree completely," I'd said, maintaining my professional composure while a growing unease began to crystallize in my chest. "I've already begun developing the implementation framework, and I've identified several expansion opportunities that could multiply the account value within the first year." Richard had nodded approvingly, but his next words had shattered every assumption I'd held about my value to Meridian Marketing Group. "Which is exactly why I've decided to transition the Phoenix account to Victoria's leadership. Her experience with large-scale client management and her established relationships within our senior team make her the ideal person to shepherd this partnership through its critical early phases." The words had hit me like a physical blow, so unexpected and devastating that for a moment I'd wondered if I'd misunderstood what he was saying. Victoria Ashford, who'd never closed an account larger than $2 million, who'd never worked in the sustainable technology sector, who'd been hired straight out of business school because of her last name rather than her qualifications, was being given the account I'd spent 8 months developing and securing. "Richard, I think there might be some confusion," I'd managed, my voice steady despite the growing panic in my chest. "Phoenix specifically requested to work with me. Dr. Chen mentioned multiple times that my understanding of their industry and my strategic approach were the primary reasons they selected Meridian. Transitioning leadership at this point could jeopardize the entire relationship." But Richard's expression had remained unchanged, carrying the kind of finality that suggested this decision had been made well before our meeting. "I understand your concern, Madison, and I want you to know that your work in securing Phoenix has been noted and appreciated. However, Victoria brings certain advantages to complex client relationships that will be essential for maximizing this opportunity." The euphemism had been clear enough. Victoria brought the advantage of being Richard Ashford's daughter, of carrying the family name that would ensure she received credit for my work while being insulated from any potential failures. She brought the advantage of sorority connections and social relationships that mattered more to Richard than actual competence or client preferences. "What advantages?" I'd asked, my professional composure beginning to crack as the full scope of what was happening became clear. "Victoria has never worked with renewable energy companies. She doesn't understand the technical complexities of Phoenix's messaging challenges. She wasn't part of the relationship-building process that made this partnership possible." Richard's patience had seemed to wear thin at my questions, his expression taking on the subtle irritation of someone unaccustomed to having his decisions challenged by subordinates. "Madison, I appreciate your passion for this account, but you need to understand that client management at this level requires more than technical knowledge. It requires the kind of strategic oversight and relationship management that comes with experience and maturity." The condescension had been unmistakable, the suggestion that my success with Phoenix had been somehow accidental, rather than the result of superior strategy and execution. The implication that Victoria, 3 years younger and with half my experience, possessed some mystical quality of maturity that I lacked simply because of her family connections. "I've been managing client relationships successfully for 3 years," I'd replied, my voice gaining strength as indignation began to override shock. "My client retention rate is the highest in the department. My account growth percentages exceed Victoria's by significant margins. Phoenix chose Meridian specifically because of my proposal and my understanding of their needs." But Richard had already moved beyond discussion into decree, his tone taking on the finality of someone who considered the conversation concluded rather than ongoing. "The decision has been made, Madison. Victoria will assume primary responsibility for Phoenix Dynamics effective immediately. I expect you to provide her with comprehensive transition materials and to support her leadership during the handover process." The dismissal had been absolute, transforming me from Phoenix's account executive into Victoria's assistant in the span of a single conversation. 3 years of building relationships, developing expertise, and delivering consistent results had been erased by nepotism so blatant that it felt like a parody of corporate dysfunction. "And my role going forward?" I'd asked, though part of me had already begun to suspect the answer. "You'll continue with your existing accounts, of course," Richard had said with the kind of casual dismissal that suggested my concerns were trivial. "Your work is valued, Madison, but Phoenix represents a level of account management that requires our senior leadership." The meeting had concluded with handshakes and professional pleasantries that felt like mockery given what had just transpired. I'd walked out of Richard's office knowing that my career at Meridian had effectively ended the moment Phoenix signed our contract. Victoria would receive credit for my work, build her reputation on my relationships, and advance her career using the foundation I'd spent months constructing. The elevator ride back to my desk had felt like descending into professional hell, each floor marking another step away from the future I'd thought I was building toward the reality of working for someone whose primary qualification was sharing DNA with the CEO. The Phoenix contracts in my portfolio felt like evidence of my own naivete, proof that I'd been so focused on excellence that I'd failed to recognize the political realities that actually determined success at Meridian. Victoria had been waiting at my desk when I'd returned, her smile carrying the kind of enthusiasm that suggested she genuinely believed she deserved the opportunity she was receiving. At 26, she possessed the unconscious confidence of someone who'd never encountered an obstacle that couldn't be overcome with family connections or sorority networking. Her MBA from Northwestern was impressive on paper, But her practical experience was limited to accounts that had been specifically selected to ensure her success. "Madison, congratulations on Phoenix," she'd said, her tone carrying what seemed like genuine warmth. "Daddy told me you did absolutely incredible work securing them. I'm so excited to build on what you've started." The casual reference to Richard as Daddy in a professional context had crystallized everything about the dynamics that governed Meridian Marketing Group. Victoria operated in a world where family relationships trumped professional qualifications, where success was inherited rather than earned, and where acknowledging that privilege was unnecessary because it had always simply existed. "Thank you," I'd managed, maintaining professional courtesy while internally processing the magnitude of what I'd lost. Phoenix is a complex account with very specific technical requirements. Dr. Chen and their team have particular expectations about messaging strategy and implementation timelines. Victoria had nodded enthusiastically, pulling out a notebook with the kind of eager attention that suggested she genuinely wanted to learn from my expertise before taking credit for it. "I'd love to understand everything about how you approach them. Your presentation must have been amazing to win such a competitive process." For the next 2 hours, I'd provided Victoria with the kind of comprehensive briefing that represented months of accumulated knowledge and strategic insight. I'd explained Phoenix's organizational structure, their decision-making processes, their technical requirements, and the relationship dynamics that had made our partnership possible. Victoria had taken diligent notes, asked thoughtful questions, and demonstrated the kind of genuine engagement that made it clear she understood the complexity of what she was inheriting. But understanding complexity and managing it successfully were entirely different skills, as became apparent when Victoria began discussing her plans for the Phoenix relationship. Her ideas were generic marketing concepts that ignored the specialized nature of renewable energy communications. Her proposed timeline ignored the technical development cycles that Phoenix had specifically identified as critical constraints. Most troubling, her approach to relationship management relied heavily on social events and entertainment that completely misread Phoenix's corporate culture. "Victoria," I'd said carefully, recognizing that challenging her approach required diplomatic precision given her family connections. "Phoenix's leadership team is very focused on measurable outcomes and strategic value. Dr. Chen specifically mentioned that she appreciated our data-driven approach rather than traditional relationship-building activities." But Victoria's confidence had remained unshaken, supported by the kind of institutional privilege that made criticism seem irrelevant rather than constructive. "Oh, I think you might be underestimating the importance of personal connections, Madison. Some of my sorority sisters work in renewable energy, and they've told me that relationship building is absolutely crucial in technical industries. Sometimes you need to help clients relax and see the bigger picture." The misunderstanding had been so fundamental that I'd realized no amount of briefing would prepare Victoria for the realities of managing Phoenix dynamics. She was approaching a sophisticated technical partnership with the same strategies she'd use for planning a charity gala, completely missing the professional rigor that had made our proposal successful in the first place. The afternoon had brought the first indication that Victoria's approach might not align with Phoenix's expectations. Dr. Chen had called requesting clarification about implementation timelines, specifically asking to speak with the account executive who developed the original proposal. Victoria had insisted on taking the call herself, introducing herself as the new account lead and attempting to address Dr. Chen's technical questions with generalized responses that demonstrated her limited understanding of renewable energy marketing. I'd watched from my desk as Victoria's side of the conversation became increasingly flustered, her confident demeanor giving way to nervous laughter, and requests for Dr. Chen to repeat questions that should have been straightforward for someone managing a $50 million account. The call had ended with Victoria promising to, quote, "circle back with detailed answers" after consulting with her team, a diplomatic way of acknowledging that she couldn't provide the immediate expertise that Phoenix expected from their marketing partner. "That went well," Victoria had announced after hanging up, her bright smile not quite concealing the anxiety that had crept into her expression. "Dr. Chen seems very detail-oriented. I think she'll appreciate the thoroughness we bring to technical questions." But the follow-up email from Phoenix had been more direct, expressing concern about the transition in account leadership and requesting assurance that their strategic requirements would continue to receive the specialized attention that had influenced their decision to partner with Meridian. The email had been professional but pointed, Exactly the kind of client communication that indicated growing dissatisfaction with service quality. By 5 o'clock, it had become clear that Victoria was struggling with aspects of the Phoenix account that I could have managed effortlessly. Her requests for assistance had become increasingly frequent, her questions revealing gaps in understanding that went beyond simple unfamiliarity with the account details. She was attempting to manage a sophisticated B2B relationship using skills better suited for consumer marketing, and the mismatch was becoming apparent to everyone involved. "Madison," she'd said, approaching my desk with the kind of hesitant smile that suggested she was about to ask for help. She knew she needed, but didn't want to admit requiring. "I'm wondering if you might be available to sit in on tomorrow's strategy session with Phoenix. Your insights could be really valuable for ensuring we address all their concerns." The request had been reasonable enough, but the underlying dynamic was clear. Victoria needed my expertise to successfully manage the account she'd been given credit for securing, but asking for help too explicitly would undermine the narrative that she was qualified to lead the relationship. I'd become a ghost consultant, providing the knowledge and strategic thinking that made Victoria's leadership possible, while remaining officially subordinate to her authority. Of course, I'd agreed, recognizing that protecting the Phoenix relationship was more important than my personal frustration with the situation. "I think it would be helpful for me to provide technical context for any implementation questions they might have." But that evening, as I'd reviewed Victoria's preliminary strategy revisions, the scope of the problem had become undeniable. Her modifications to my original proposal were not just different, they were fundamentally incompatible with Phoenix's stated objectives and industry requirements. She'd simplified technical messaging to the point of meaninglessness, proposed timelines that ignored regulatory approval processes, and suggested promotional strategies that would have been appropriate for consumer products, but disastrous for B2B renewable energy marketing. The realization that Victoria was going to damage the Phoenix relationship through inexperience and overconfidence had kept me awake most of the night, staring at the ceiling and understanding that I was watching the systematic destruction of the most important professional achievement of my career. Phoenix had chosen Meridian because of my understanding of their needs, my strategic approach, and my demonstrated expertise in their industry. Victoria's management was going to prove that their trust had been misplaced, and there was nothing I could do to prevent the disaster I could see approaching with mathematical certainty. The next morning had brought the confrontation that would end my career at Meridian Marketing Group, though I hadn't understood the stakes when Victoria had requested a private meeting to discuss some concerns about team dynamics. I'd assumed she wanted to address the obvious challenges she was facing with Phoenix management, perhaps to formalize a consulting arrangement that would allow me to provide the expertise she clearly needed while maintaining her official leadership role. Instead, Victoria had ambushed me with accusations that demonstrated exactly how privilege operates when threatened by competence. She'd claimed that my, quote, resistance to her leadership was undermining team morale and creating confusion about account management responsibilities. She'd suggested that my proprietary attitude toward Phoenix was preventing effective knowledge transfer and collaborative problem-solving. Most devastatingly, she'd argued that my continued involvement with Phoenix was sending mixed messages to the client about who was actually responsible for their account. "Madison, I think we need to be honest about what's happening here," Victoria had said, her tone carrying the kind of disappointed authority that suggested she was delivering constructive criticism rather than orchestrating character assassination. "Your attachment to Phoenix is understandable, but it's becoming counterproductive for everyone involved." The accusation had been so precisely calculated that I'd recognized it as character assassination rather than legitimate feedback. Victoria was systematically reframing my expertise as possessiveness, my willingness to help as resistance to authority, and my knowledge of Phoenix's needs as an obstacle to her success. She was creating a narrative that would justify my removal from the account while positioning herself as the victim of my alleged unprofessionalism. "Victoria, I've provided every piece of information you've requested," I'd replied, maintaining professional composure while recognizing that this conversation was designed to document grounds for my removal rather than resolve any actual problems. "My goal has been ensuring that Phoenix receives the quality of service that convinced them to partner with Meridian." But Victoria's narrative had already been constructed, supported by selective interpretations of interactions that ignored context and intent. She'd characterized my technical corrections as condescension, my strategic suggestions as undermining, and my availability for consultation as an inability to transition responsibilities appropriately. Every attempt I'd made to help her succeed had been reframed as evidence of my failure to accept her authority. "I think the problem is that you're having trouble adjusting to a supervisory relationship," Victoria had continued, her voice taking on the patient tone of someone explaining obvious truths to someone too emotional to understand them. "Phoenix is my account now, and I need team members who can support my leadership rather than questioning my decisions." The meeting had concluded with Victoria recommending that I be reassigned to accounts that were more appropriate for my experience level, a diplomatic way of suggesting that my involvement with major clients was problematic for reasons that had nothing to do with competence or performance. She'd framed the recommendation as being in my best interest, an opportunity to quote-unquote focus on developing leadership skills before taking on accounts that required senior-level relationship management. Within an hour, Richard Ashford had called me into his office for what he'd described as a quote-unquote personnel development conversation, but which was clearly a termination meeting disguised as career counseling. The decision had already been made, the narrative already constructed, and my role was simply to accept the consequences of threatening Victoria's position by being more qualified than she was. "Madison, I've been speaking with Victoria about team dynamics surrounding the Phoenix transition," Richard had begun, his tone carrying the kind of regretful authority that suggested he was delivering unfortunate but necessary news. "It's become clear that the current arrangement isn't working optimally for anyone involved." The euphemisms had been professionally crafted but transparent in their intent. I was being terminated for the crime of being more competent than the CEO's daughter, for making Victoria's inexperience apparent through contrast, and for representing a threat to the narrative that her promotion was based on merit rather than nepotism. "I've reviewed Victoria's concerns," I'd said, recognizing that defending myself was pointless, but unable to accept the injustice without some attempt at pushback. "My performance reviews have been consistently excellent. My client satisfaction scores exceed department averages. Phoenix specifically requested my continued involvement in their account management." But Richard's decision had been final, backed by the kind of institutional power that made individual merit irrelevant when it conflicted with family interests. "Sometimes talented people find themselves in situations that don't fully utilize their capabilities," he'd said, delivering the kind of meaningless corporate speak that was designed to obscure rather than clarify. "I think you'll find that this transition creates opportunities for growth that wouldn't have been possible within your current role." The severance package had been generous enough to prevent legal challenges while being insufficient to compensate for the career damage that would result from being terminated immediately after securing the company's biggest client. 3 months of salary and benefits, a neutral reference letter, and a non-disclosure agreement that would prevent me from discussing the circumstances of my departure with potential employers or industry contacts. "You're firing me for being too good at my job," I'd said, abandoning professional diplomacy for the clarity that Richard's euphemisms were designed to avoid. "We're restructuring your position to better align with our evolving needs," he'd replied, maintaining the corporate fiction even when it was no longer necessary. "I think you'll find that this change creates opportunities for professional growth that wouldn't have been possible here." And that was how I'd found myself in the elevator, descending toward a parking garage that felt like the entrance to professional purgatory, carrying a cardboard box that contained the remnants of a career that had been destroyed, not by failure or incompetence, but by the simple crime of outshining someone whose last name mattered more than her qualifications. The parking garage had been nearly empty at 11 in the morning, most of my former colleagues still upstairs pretending to work while probably gossiping about my sudden departure. My car, a reliable Honda Civic that reflected the practical choices of someone who'd been building a career rather than inheriting one, sat alone under the fluorescent lights like a faithful friend, waiting to take me away from the scene of my professional execution. As I'd loaded my box into the trunk, my phone had buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The preview showed just enough to make my heart race with a mixture of hope and dread. "Ms. Clarke, this is Dr. Chen from Phoenix Dynamics. I need to speak with you urgently about..." The full message had been longer, but even those few words had been enough to confirm what I'd suspected would happen. Phoenix had already noticed the difference in service quality, had already begun questioning whether Meridian could deliver the expertise they'd been promised, and were reaching out to the person they'd actually wanted to work with. But I'd been legally prohibited from responding to their concerns, bound by the non-disclosure agreement that prevented me from explaining why their account was now being managed by someone with no relevant experience or industry knowledge. I'd become a ghost in my own professional life, watching from the outside as the relationships I'd built were systematically destroyed by someone whose primary qualification was sharing DNA with the decision-maker. The drive home had been a blur of growing anger and crystallizing determination. I'd spent 3 years building my reputation and expertise, only to have it stolen by someone who would use my work as a stepping stone to unearned success. Victoria would receive credit for securing Phoenix, benefit from the relationships I'd developed, and advance her career using the foundation I'd created through months of strategic work and client development. But as I'd pulled into my driveway, something had begun to shift in my perspective. The devastation was real, the injustice was infuriating, but underneath the immediate pain was something else. A growing awareness that I'd been operating under assumptions about power and influence that might not reflect the complete picture of my situation. My phone had been buzzing consistently with messages from former clients expressing concern about my sudden departure, colleagues questioning the official explanation for my termination, and industry contacts who'd heard rumors about problems at Meridian. The Phoenix situation was becoming public knowledge faster than Richard had probably anticipated, and the narrative Victoria was trying to control was beginning to unravel, as people who understood the industry recognized the mismatch between her qualifications and her new responsibilities. But the call that would change everything had come at exactly 2:17 p.m., just as I'd been contemplating the humiliating process of job searching after being terminated from a position where I'd been objectively successful. The caller ID had shown a number I hadn't recognized, but the voice on the other end had been warmly familiar, despite the years that had passed since I'd heard it. "Madison, darling, it's your Aunt Catherine," the voice had said, carrying the kind of authoritative warmth that had always made my great-aunt seem larger than life during my childhood. "I've just heard the most interesting news about your recent career developments, and I think it's time we had a conversation about some family matters that your parents and I decided you weren't ready to understand until now." The words had sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the air conditioning, carrying implications that suggested my understanding of my own identity and resources was about to be fundamentally challenged. Aunt Catherine had always been the mysterious family member, the one who lived in the penthouse downtown and sent expensive birthday gifts without ever explaining the source of her obviously substantial wealth. "Aunt Catherine, I'm not sure what you've heard, but I'm fine," I'd begun, not wanting to burden family with my professional problems. "Oh, sweetheart," she'd interrupted, with the kind of gentle laughter that suggested she knew far more about my situation than I'd assumed possible. "I know exactly what happened at Meridian, and I know exactly why Richard Ashford made the mistake of his lifetime, when he decided that competence was less important than nepotism. What I don't think you know is who your grandmother really was, and what that means for your current situation." The conversation that followed had lasted exactly 43 minutes, and had systematically demolished every assumption I'd held about my family, my resources, and my position in the world that had just rejected me so completely. Aunt Catherine hadn't just been the mysterious wealthy relative I'd grown up wondering about. She'd been the CEO of Clarke Industries for the past 30 years, building the company that my grandmother Helena had founded into one of the most influential private corporations in the region. "Your grandmother was Helena Clarke," Aunt Catherine had explained, with the patient tone of someone revealing information that should have been obvious but had somehow been hidden. "Not Helena Johnson, as you've always known her. She founded Clarke Industries in 1952 with a small business loan and the kind of strategic brilliance that built empires. When she died 15 years ago, she left very specific instructions about when and how you should learn about your inheritance. The revelation had hit me like a physical blow, reshaping everything I'd understood about my family history and my own place in the world. My grandmother, who I'd remembered as a gentle woman who baked cookies and told stories, had apparently been a business legend whose name was synonymous with ethical corporate leadership and strategic innovation. The trust activates on your 30th birthday, which is next month, or in the event that you find yourself in a situation where you need protection from people who would use power to suppress merit, Catherine had continued. I'd say being fired for outshining the boss's daughter qualifies as exactly the kind of situation Helena designed the trust to address. The numbers Catherine had shared were almost impossible to process. Clarke Industries wasn't just successful. It was one of the largest privately held corporations in the region, with holdings that included everything from renewable energy development to strategic marketing consulting. The trust that bore my name contained not just money, but controlling interest in companies that could make Meridian Marketing Group disappear with a single phone call. 60% of Clarke Industries becomes yours next month, Catherine had said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd been waiting years to deliver this news. That includes our subsidiary companies, our investment portfolio, and our strategic partnerships. You're not just Madison Clarke, unemployed marketing executive. You're Madison Clarke, majority owner of a business empire that your fired boss couldn't afford to buy with his entire net worth. But the most devastating revelation had been saved for last, the information that would transform my termination from a professional setback into the strategic error that would destroy the people who'd engineered it. Phoenix Dynamics has been a Clarke Industries partner for 8 years, Catherine had said, her voice taking on the dangerous calm of someone who understood exactly what this meant for Meridian's future. Dr. Chen reports directly to our board of directors on all major strategic decisions, including marketing partnerships. When she finds out that Richard Ashford fired the granddaughter of Helena Clarke for threatening his daughter's career prospects, Phoenix's contract with Meridian will be terminated before the ink is dry on their first invoice. The conversation had ended with an invitation to dinner at Catherine's penthouse that evening, where I would meet the legal team that had been managing my inheritance for 15 years and learn about the resources that were about to become available for addressing the injustices I'd experienced. As I'd sat in my living room, processing information that fundamentally changed everything I'd thought I knew about my life, I'd begun to understand that my termination from Meridian hadn't been the end of my career. It had been the catalyst that would activate resources I'd never known existed, resources that would make Richard and Victoria Ashford's victory celebration extremely short-lived. The woman who'd been humiliated and discarded this morning was Madison Clarke, marketing executive. The woman who would walk into Catherine's penthouse tonight was Madison Clarke, majority heir to an business empire that was about to demonstrate exactly why underestimating a Clarke had historically been a career-ending mistake. Phoenix Dynamics was about to learn that their marketing partner had fired their most important client's granddaughter. And Richard Ashford was about to discover that some victories come with consequences that destroy everything you thought you'd won. The elevator to Catherine's penthouse required a special keycard that she'd had delivered to my apartment by courier within 2 hours of our phone conversation. As the floors climbed past the city's most exclusive addresses, I found myself studying my reflection in the polished brass doors, trying to reconcile the woman staring back at me, with the revelation that I was apparently heir to one of the region's most powerful business empires. My navy dress was appropriate for a family dinner, but it felt inadequate for meeting with someone who'd just informed me that I was about to inherit controlling interest in a corporation that could purchase Meridian Marketing Group as an afterthought. The penthouse occupied the entire 42nd floor of downtown's most prestigious building, a space that whispered wealth in the way that only truly generational money could achieve. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered commanding views of the city sprawling below, while museum-quality artwork and understated furnishings created an atmosphere of power that was never ostentatious but always unmistakable. Catherine had greeted me with the kind of embrace that suggested she'd been waiting years for this moment, her silver hair perfectly styled, and her dark eyes sharp with intelligence that reminded me immediately of my grandmother's penetrating gaze. "You look exactly like Helena did at your age," she'd said, stepping back to study me with the kind of assessment that felt both familial and strategic. "Same determination in your eyes, same refusal to back down when you know you're right. She would have been absolutely furious about what happened to you today." The dining room table had been set for 4, though Catherine had initially mentioned only the 2 of us for dinner. The additional place setting suggested that this evening was more than a family reunion. It was apparently a business meeting disguised as a social gathering. The legal documents spread across Catherine's mahogany sideboard confirmed that impression. Thick folders bearing the letterhead of firms I recognized as representing the kind of clients who measured their net worth in hundreds of millions rather than thousands. "Before we discuss your inheritance," Catherine had said, pouring wine that probably cost more than I'd made in a month at Meridian, "I want you to understand exactly who your grandmother was and why she structured your trust the way she did. Helena Clarke didn't just build a successful business. She created an empire specifically designed to protect family members from the kind of institutional injustice you experience today. The story that emerged over dinner was nothing like the gentle grandmother I'd remembered from childhood visits. Helena Clarke had been a strategic genius who'd recognized that women in business needed more than competence to succeed. They needed overwhelming resource advantages that made discrimination prohibitively expensive for those who practiced it. She'd built Clarke Industries not just as a profitable enterprise, but as a weapon against the kind of systematic exclusion that had nearly destroyed her own early career. Helena was fired from 3 different positions in the 1950s, Catherine explained, her voice carrying the satisfied tone of someone who understood exactly how those dismissals had ultimately backfired on the men who'd engineered them. Each time it was for the same reason you were fired today. She was too competent, too threatening to men who'd inherited their positions rather than earning them. So she decided to build something that would ensure no Clarke woman would ever be vulnerable to that kind of professional assassination again. The documentation Catherine produced painted a picture of methodical empire building that spanned 7 decades. Helena had started with a small consulting firm, but her real genius had been recognizing emerging industries before they became profitable, and positioning Clarke Industries as an essential partner for companies that would eventually dominate their sectors. Renewable energy, sustainable technology, digital marketing, strategic consulting, all areas where Clarke Industries had established market leadership before most people understood their potential. Phoenix Dynamics has been a Clarke Industries partner since Dr. Chen was a junior researcher, Catherine continued, pulling out correspondence that dated back nearly a decade. We provided the initial funding for their renewable energy research, connected them with manufacturing partners, and helped them develop the marketing strategies that made them industry leaders. Their partnership with Meridian was specifically based on Dr. Chen's recommendation of you as someone who understood both the technical and strategic requirements of their expansion. The implications were staggering. Phoenix hadn't just chosen Meridian because of my proposal. They'd chosen Meridian because Dr. Chen had specifically requested to work with me, apparently based on intelligence about my family connections that I'd been completely unaware of. My success in securing the account hadn't been purely merit-based. It had been facilitated by relationships I'd never known existed. But Catherine had been quick to address the insecurity that revelation created. "Don't think for a moment that your family connections diminished your achievement," she'd said, recognizing the concern in my expression. "Dr. Chen could have recommended any marketing firm in the country. She chose Meridian specifically because your strategic approach and industry expertise impressed her so much that she wanted to work with you personally. The family connection simply gave her confidence that you would receive the institutional support necessary to deliver exceptional results." The legal team had arrived precisely at 8 o'clock, 3 attorneys whose reputations I recognized from business publications, and whose presence suggested that my inheritance involved complexities that required serious legal expertise. Margaret Thornton was Clarke Industries' general counsel, a woman whose strategic litigation had protected the company from hostile takeover attempts for 20 years. David Kim specialized in corporate acquisitions and had structured some of the most complex business deals in the region's history. Sarah Chen, no relation to Dr. Chen at Phoenix, was an expert in employment law, whose clients included executives who'd been wrongfully terminated from major corporations. "Miss Clarke," Margaret had begun, opening a folder that contained documents bearing official seals and signatures that spoke to years of careful legal preparation. "Your grandmother's trust becomes active in 3 weeks when you turn 30, but the circumstances of your termination today trigger the emergency provisions that were specifically designed to address situations like this." The emergency provisions were Helena's masterstroke, legal mechanisms that activated whenever a Clarke family member faced professional retaliation for ethical behavior or superior performance. The trust didn't just provide financial resources. It created institutional obligations for Clarke Industries to actively protect family members from the kind of systematic discrimination that had nearly destroyed Helena's early career. "As of tonight," David explained, consulting documents that had apparently been prepared years in advance, "you become acting majority shareholder of Clarke Industries with full authority to make strategic decisions regarding corporate partnerships, business relationships, and competitive responses to companies that have demonstrated hostility to Clarke family interests." The power being described was almost incomprehensible. Clarke Industries owned majority stakes in 12 different companies, maintained strategic partnerships with dozens of major corporations, and controlled investment funds that could influence market conditions in multiple industries. The trust wasn't just making me wealthy, it was making me one of the most powerful business leaders in the region, with resources that dwarfed anything Richard Ashford could imagine. But Sarah Chen had been focused on more immediate concerns, specifically the legal vulnerabilities that Meridian had created through their handling of my termination. Mr. Ashford made several critical errors that expose his company to significant liability, she'd explained, reviewing notes that suggested she'd already begun investigating my case. Terminating an employee immediately after they secured a major client, especially when that termination benefits a family member, creates a clear pattern of nepotism that violates federal employment protection statutes. The legal analysis was devastating for Meridian's position. Richard's decision to give Victoria credit for my work, combined with my immediate termination after delivering exceptional results, created documentation that would support charges of discrimination, wrongful termination, and potentially racketeering if the pattern could be extended to other employees who'd been similarly mistreated. More importantly, Margaret had added, her voice taking on the dangerous calm of someone who specialized in corporate warfare, Meridian's breach of their fiduciary duty to Phoenix Dynamics creates grounds for contract termination with full damages. When Dr. Chen learns that they fired the account executive she specifically requested, their partnership agreement includes provisions that make Meridian liable for all costs associated with finding alternative marketing representation. But the most devastating weapon in Helena's arsenal was something she'd anticipated would eventually be necessary: a network of corporate relationships that could isolate hostile companies from essential business partnerships. Clarke Industries wasn't just successful in isolation, it was connected to every major business leader, law firm, and financial institution in the region through strategic partnerships that had been cultivated over decades. Helena called it the accountability network, Catherine explained, pulling out a diagram that looked like a complex web connecting dozens of major corporations. Companies that demonstrated ethical business practices received preferential treatment, access to exclusive partnerships, and protection from predatory competitors. Companies that operated through nepotism, discrimination, or fraudulent practices found themselves systematically excluded from opportunities until they either reformed their behavior or were forced out of business entirely. The network's power was subtle but overwhelming. Clarke Industries controlled enough market influence to make life extremely difficult for companies that operated unethically, not through direct confrontation, but through the gradual withdrawal of opportunities that made sustainable business impossible. Suppliers would become unavailable, financing would be more expensive, and potential clients would mysteriously choose alternative service providers. Meridian Marketing Group is about to discover exactly how expensive it becomes to operate a business when Clarke Industries decides you're a liability to the region's professional community, David had said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd orchestrated similar corporate destructions before. Richard Ashford thought he was protecting his daughter's career by removing a competent threat. What he actually did was declare war on one of the most powerful business families in the state. The strategic plan that emerged during dinner was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential impact. Phase 1 would begin immediately with Phoenix Dynamics terminating their contract with Meridian, based on breach of fiduciary duty, citing the removal of the account executive they'd specifically requested and the substitution of someone with no relevant experience. The termination would be accompanied by demands for full reimbursement of all fees paid, plus damages for having to restart their marketing implementation with a new firm. Phase 2 would involve Clarke Industries' network of business partners becoming aware of Meridian's employment practices through carefully orchestrated industry communications. Companies that relied on ethical partners would begin questioning whether Meridian's approach to personnel management reflected broader problems with professional integrity and strategic competence. Phase 3 was the most subtle but potentially most destructive. Clarke Industries would launch its own marketing division, specifically targeting companies that valued ethical leadership and merit-based advancement. The message would be clear, without being explicit. Businesses that wanted to partner with organizations that promoted based on competence rather than family connections should consider alternatives to firms that operated through nepotism. The beauty of your grandmother's approach, Sarah had explained, is that everything we're planning is completely legal and ethically justifiable. We're not engaging in unfair business practices. We're simply choosing to work with companies that share our values and avoiding those that don't. If Meridian's approach to human resources makes them unsuitable partners, that's a consequence of their own decisions rather than external manipulation. But Catherine had been planning something more personal, a confrontation that would demonstrate to Richard and Victoria Ashford exactly what they'd unleashed when they'd decided that competence was less important than family connections. "Tomorrow morning," she'd said, her voice taking on the anticipatory tone of someone who'd been waiting years for this opportunity, "you and I are going to pay a visit to Meridian Marketing Group, not as angry family members seeking revenge, but as representatives of Clarke Industries conducting due diligence on a potential business partner." The plan was psychologically perfect. Richard would be expecting to deal with the aftermath of firing a troublesome employee. Instead, he'd be facing representatives of one of the region's most powerful corporations, who were evaluating whether Meridian was suitable for a partnership that could transform their business. The cognitive dissonance would be devastating, forcing him to recognize that his understanding of the power dynamics had been completely wrong. "We'll let him make his presentation about Meridian's capabilities and recent account acquisitions," Catherine had continued, her eyes bright with anticipation. "He'll probably mention the Phoenix Dynamics partnership as evidence of their ability to compete for major clients. And then we'll explain exactly who was responsible for securing that relationship, and why her termination makes any partnership with Clarke Industries impossible." But the most satisfying element of the plan was its educational value for Victoria Ashford, who would presumably be present to demonstrate her competence with major client relationships. She would learn that the woman she'd replaced was not just a talented employee but the heir to resources that made her father's business look like a corner lemonade stand. The humiliation would be complete but entirely self-inflicted, the natural consequence of assuming that family connections mattered more than actual qualifications. "Your grandmother always said that the best revenge against people who abuse power is demonstrating exactly how little power they actually have," Catherine had observed, raising her wineglass in a toast that felt like a declaration of war. "Tomorrow, Richard Ashford is going to learn that lesson in the most expensive way possible." The evening had concluded with Margaret providing me with legal documents that formally activated my emergency authority within Clarke Industries. Corporate credit cards that had no practical spending limits, and contact information for security personnel who would ensure my safety if the confrontation with Meridian became hostile. The transformation from unemployed marketing executive to majority shareholder of a business empire had taken exactly 4 hours and had left me feeling like I was living someone else's life. The drive home had been surreal, navigating familiar streets while processing the reality that I now controlled resources that could reshape the business landscape of the entire region. My Honda Civic felt absurdly modest for someone who apparently owned a fleet of corporate vehicles, but there was something comforting about maintaining that connection to my previous life while everything else was changing so rapidly. My apartment had felt smaller when I'd returned, not because of its physical dimensions but because of my expanded understanding of what was possible. The modest furnishings and careful budget consciousness that had defined my lifestyle for years now seemed like the artifacts of someone else's existence, someone who hadn't known that she was heir to one of the region's most successful business empires. But sleep had been impossible as I'd processed the implications of what would happen the next morning. Richard Ashford would be expecting to begin his Wednesday morning with the satisfaction of having successfully eliminated a threat to his daughter's advancement. Instead, he was going to receive an education in exactly how catastrophic his assumptions about power and influence had been. The morning had begun with a call from Dr. Chen at Phoenix Dynamics, though I was now legally prohibited from taking her call directly due to the non-disclosure agreement I'd signed as part of my severance package. Instead, I'd listened to her voicemail with growing satisfaction as she expressed concerns about Victoria's competence and requested clarification about why her preferred account executive was no longer available. "Miss Clarke, this is Dr. Chen from Phoenix Dynamics." Her recorded voice had been professionally controlled but clearly frustrated. "I've been trying to reach you regarding some concerns about our marketing partnership with Meridian. Victoria Ashford seems to have fundamental misunderstandings about our industry requirements, and her proposed timelines ignore regulatory constraints that we specifically discussed during your presentation. I need to understand why you're no longer managing our account and whether there are alternative arrangements that would ensure we receive the expertise we were promised. The voicemail had been exactly what Catherine's legal team had predicted would happen. Phoenix was already questioning Meridian's competence and specifically requesting my involvement, creating the perfect foundation for contract termination based on breach of fiduciary duty. Catherine had arrived at my apartment at precisely 9 o'clock, emerging from a black BMW that whispered expensive engineering and understated luxury. Her business attire was impeccably tailored but understated, projecting the kind of authority that never needed to announce itself because it was simply assumed by everyone in the room. She'd brought additional documentation about Clarke Industries' business relationships and a briefing folder that contained more information about Meridian's financial position than Richard probably realized was publicly available. "Ready to give Richard Ashford the most expensive education of his career?" she'd asked, her voice carrying the anticipatory satisfaction of someone who'd been planning this moment for years. The drive to Meridian had been conducted in comfortable silence, both of us understanding that the confrontation ahead would fundamentally alter the trajectory of multiple careers and businesses. Catherine's BMW had attracted attention in Meridian's parking garage, where it stood out among the practical sedans and modest SUVs that reflected the financial realities of employees rather than owners. The elevator ride to Meridian's executive floor had felt like ascending toward a reckoning that had been building since Helena Clarke's first experience with professional discrimination 70 years earlier. Catherine had reviewed her notes one final time, ensuring that every detail of Clarke Industries' business relationships was precisely documented, and that the legal implications of Meridian's personnel decisions were clearly articulated. "Remember," she'd said as the elevator approached the executive floor, "we're not here as angry family members seeking revenge. We're here as representatives of Clarke Industries, evaluating whether Meridian meets our standards for ethical business partnerships. Let Richard make his case for why we should consider working with them, and then let him discover exactly what he's destroyed." The receptionist had greeted us with the kind of professional enthusiasm that suggested Catherine's assistant had scheduled this meeting as a potential new business opportunity rather than a confrontation. Richard had been immediately available, his schedule apparently cleared for what his assistant had described as a strategic partnership discussion with one of the region's most successful corporations. Richard's office had been exactly as I'd remembered it, all polished wood and strategic awards that spoke to decades of business success built on relationships and reputation, rather than innovation or exceptional service. But seeing it now, with my new understanding of actual business success, the space felt smaller and less impressive, like a theatrical set designed to impress people who didn't understand what real corporate power looked like. "Ms. Clarke, what a pleasure to meet you," Richard had begun, rising from behind his desk with the confident smile of someone who believed he was about to secure a partnership that would transform his business. "I understand Clarke Industries is considering marketing partnerships, and I'm excited to discuss how Meridian can support your strategic objectives." Catherine had accepted his handshake with the kind of professional courtesy that revealed nothing about her actual intentions, allowing Richard to control the conversation while she gathered intelligence about his assumptions and expectations. "Thank you for making time for us on such short notice, Mr. Ashford. Clarke Industries is always interested in working with firms that demonstrate exceptional competence and ethical leadership." The emphasis on ethical leadership had been subtle but pointed, a reference that Richard had missed entirely but which set the foundation for what was coming. He'd launched into a presentation about Meridian's capabilities and recent successes, clearly attempting to demonstrate that his firm was worthy of partnership with one of the region's most successful corporations. "We've just secured Phoenix Dynamics as a major client," Richard had announced with obvious pride, apparently viewing this as his strongest selling point for attracting Clarke Industries business. "A $50 million account that demonstrates our ability to compete for and win partnerships with industry-leading companies in the renewable energy sector." Catherine had nodded approvingly, maintaining the fiction that this was information she was learning for the first time, rather than a development she'd been anticipating for weeks. "Impressive. Phoenix Dynamics is certainly a respected organization. What was your strategic approach for securing such a competitive account?" Richard's answer had been professionally crafted but fundamentally dishonest, taking credit for strategy and relationship building that had been entirely my work while presenting Victoria's involvement as the key factor in closing the deal. He'd described his team's innovative approach to renewable energy marketing and their deep understanding of Phoenix's technical requirements, systematically erasing my contributions while positioning Victoria as the strategic genius who'd made the partnership possible. Victoria Ashford, who leads our renewable energy practice, brought a unique combination of technical expertise and relationship management skills that impressed Phoenix's leadership team, Richard had continued, his confidence growing as he apparently believed his presentation was succeeding. Her strategic vision and industry connections were essential factors in their decision to partner with Meridian. The lies had been so blatant that I'd found myself struggling to maintain professional composure, but Catherine had remained perfectly calm, allowing Richard to construct the narrative that would make his eventual humiliation even more complete. She'd asked detailed questions about implementation timelines, strategic challenges, and client satisfaction metrics, all of which Richard had answered with confidence that suggested he actually believed his version of events. "I'd be very interested in meeting Victoria," Catherine had said, her tone suggesting genuine enthusiasm for learning more about Meridian's renewable energy capabilities. Her expertise sounds exactly like what Clarke Industries looks for in potential partners. Richard had immediately called Victoria into the meeting, clearly viewing this as an opportunity to demonstrate his daughter's competence to representatives of a major corporation. Victoria had arrived within minutes, perfectly dressed and professionally composed, carrying herself with the confidence of someone who believed she'd earned her recent promotion through merit rather than family connections. "Ms. Clarke, this is Victoria Ashford, our renewable energy practice leader," Richard had announced with obvious paternal pride. Victoria was instrumental in securing the Phoenix Dynamics partnership, and I think you'll find her insights about sustainable technology marketing very valuable. Victoria had greeted Catherine with enthusiasm that suggested she viewed this meeting as validation of her new role, and perhaps an opportunity to demonstrate her competence to industry leaders. Her handshake had been confident, her smile genuine, and her demeanor that of someone who had no reason to suspect that this conversation would end with the complete destruction of everything she thought she'd achieved. "Mr. Ashford, Victoria," Catherine had said, her voice taking on a tone that suggested the conversation was about to shift in a direction that neither of them had anticipated. "Before we discuss potential partnerships, I need to address some concerns about Meridian's recent personnel decisions and their impact on existing client relationships." The change in atmosphere had been immediate and dramatic. Richard's confident expression had faltered as he'd begun to sense that this meeting wasn't proceeding as he'd expected, while Victoria had looked confused about why personnel decisions would be relevant to a strategic partnership discussion. "I'm not sure I understand," Richard had said, his voice taking on the careful tone of someone who is beginning to recognize that he might be in dangerous territory, but wasn't yet sure why. "Phoenix Dynamics has been a Clarke Industries partner for 8 years, Catherine had continued, pulling out documentation that proved the relationship while watching Richard's face as the implications began to dawn on him. "Dr. Chen reports directly to our board of directors on all major strategic decisions, including the selection of marketing partners." The revelation had hit Richard like a physical blow, his confident demeanor evaporating as he'd begun to understand that his understanding of the Phoenix relationship had been completely wrong. But Catherine had been far from finished, and the worst was yet to come. "Dr. Chen specifically recommended Madison Clarke for the Phoenix account," Catherine had continued, watching Victoria's confusion turn to growing alarm as she'd begun to recognize a name that should have been familiar. She was impressed by Madison's strategic approach and industry expertise, and she specifically requested that Madison manage their relationship with whatever marketing firm they ultimately selected. The silence in Richard's office had been deafening as both father and daughter had begun to process information that fundamentally challenged everything they'd assumed about their recent victory. Victoria's face had gone pale as she'd started to understand that the woman she'd replaced hadn't been just another employee, but someone with family connections that made her own privileges look insignificant. "Madison Clarke," Richard had repeated slowly, his voice hollow as the full scope of his miscalculation had begun to crystallize. "The employee we terminated yesterday." "The employee you terminated," Catherine had corrected, her voice taking on the dangerous calm of someone who was about to deliver a lesson that would be remembered for years. "My granddaughter. Helena Clarke's heir." The woman who will inherit 60% of Clarke Industries in 3 weeks and who, as of yesterday evening, has emergency authority to make strategic decisions regarding corporate partnerships and business relationships. The devastation had been complete and immediate. Richard had sunk into his chair as if his legs could no longer support him, while Victoria had stared at Catherine with the expression of someone watching her entire future collapse in real time. The Phoenix account that they'd thought represented their greatest triumph had actually been a relationship facilitated by family connections they'd never suspected. And their decision to steal credit for Madison's work had just destroyed any possibility of maintaining that partnership. Dr. Chen called this morning to express concerns about the change in account leadership, Catherine had continued, delivering information that made their situation even worse. She's specifically requesting Madison's return to the account and questioning whether Meridian has the expertise to deliver the services Phoenix was promised. But the truly devastating news was still coming. The information that would transform their tactical victory into a strategic disaster that would destroy everything they'd thought they'd accomplished. As of this morning, Catherine had announced, consulting her phone as if she were checking routine business updates rather than delivering a death sentence to their careers. Phoenix Dynamics has formally terminated their contract with Meridian Marketing Group for breach of fiduciary duty. They're also demanding full reimbursement of all fees paid, plus damages for the costs associated with finding alternative marketing representation. The silence that followed had been broken only by Victoria's sharp intake of breath, as she'd realized that her stolen promotion had just cost her father's company their biggest client, along with potentially millions of dollars in damages and lost revenue. The devastation in Richard's office was palpable as the magnitude of their miscalculations settled over both father and daughter like a suffocating blanket. Victoria had gripped the edge of her chair so tightly that her knuckles had turned white, while Richard stared at Catherine with the hollow expression of someone watching his entire business empire crumble in real time. The Phoenix contract that had represented their greatest triumph just 24 hours earlier had become the instrument of their professional destruction, and the employee they'd discarded as inconsequential had revealed herself to be connected to resources that could obliterate everything they'd spent years building. There must be some misunderstanding, Richard had managed, his voice cracking with desperation, as he'd attempted to process information that challenged every assumption he'd held about power dynamics and business relationships. Madison never mentioned any family connections to Clarke Industries. If we'd known about her background, obviously we would have handled the situation differently. Catherine's smile had been sharp as surgical steel, carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd watched this exact scenario play out exactly as her mother had predicted it would decades earlier. Madison doesn't know about family connections because Helena specifically instructed that her inheritance remain confidential until she demonstrated that she could succeed based on merit alone. Your decision to fire her for outshining your daughter just proved that she needed the protection Helena designed the trust to provide. The legal implications were becoming clearer with each passing moment, and Richard's corporate instincts were beginning to catalog the multiple ways his personnel decisions had created liability that could destroy Meridian completely. Wrongful termination, breach of fiduciary duty to Phoenix, potential discrimination charges, and now the prospect of facing legal action from one of the region's most powerful corporations with unlimited resources for litigation. What would it take to resolve this situation? Richard had asked, his voice carrying the desperate tone of someone who recognized that he was negotiating from a position of complete weakness. Madison is obviously a valuable employee, and if there was a misunderstanding about her role with Phoenix, I'm sure we can work something out that benefits everyone involved. But Catherine had been far beyond the point where Meridian could negotiate their way out of the consequences they'd created for themselves. Mr. Ashford, you didn't just fire an employee. You systematically stole credit for her work, gave her position to your unqualified daughter, and then terminated her when her competence made Victoria's inexperience obvious. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was calculated professional assassination designed to protect your family interests at the expense of merit and ethical business practices. Victoria had finally found her voice, though it had emerged as little more than a whisper, as she'd begun to understand that her stolen promotion had just cost her father everything he'd spent his career building. I never asked him to fire Madison. I thought she was just having trouble adjusting to my leadership style. I didn't know about any family connections. The attempt at damage control had been pathetic in its transparency, and Catherine had dismissed it with the kind of contempt reserved for people who refuse to take responsibility for their actions, even when faced with overwhelming evidence of their guilt. Victoria, you specifically complained to your father about Madison's supposed resistance to your authority. Despite the fact that she was providing you with expertise you desperately needed to avoid destroying the Phoenix relationship, you demanded her removal from the account she'd secured, and you accepted credit for work you'd never done. Ignorance about consequences doesn't excuse deliberate unethical behavior. The documentation Catherine had brought painted a picture of systematic nepotism that extended far beyond my individual situation. Meridian's employment practices showed a clear pattern of promoting family members and friends, while marginalizing employees whose competence threatened established hierarchies. Richard had created a culture where merit was subordinate to relationships, and Phoenix's termination was simply the most visible consequence of business practices that violated both ethical standards and legal requirements. Clarke Industries will be conducting a comprehensive review of Meridian's employment practices and client relationships, Catherine had announced, consulting notes that suggested this investigation had been planned with military precision. We'll be particularly interested in whether other employees have experienced similar retaliation for demonstrating competence that threatened the advancement of less qualified colleagues. The threat had been unmistakable. Catherine wasn't just addressing my individual termination. She was positioning Clarke Industries to systematically dismantle Meridian's business relationships and expose patterns of discrimination that could result in federal investigations and class action lawsuits. Richard's decision to fire me hadn't just cost him the Phoenix account. It had triggered a corporate audit that could reveal years of unethical practices. But the most devastating blow was still coming. Information that would transform Meridian's crisis from a major setback into a complete business failure that would destroy Richard's reputation and eliminate any possibility of recovery. Catherine had saved the worst news for last, allowing Richard and Victoria to fully understand the scope of their immediate losses before delivering the information that would make those losses permanent. Madison will be assuming her position as majority shareholder of Clarke Industries next week, Catherine had said, her voice carrying the finality of someone announcing an execution rather than a business transition. Her first official act will be launching Clarke Marketing Solutions, a subsidiary specifically designed to serve clients who value ethical leadership and merit-based advancement. We'll be actively recruiting employees from firms that operate through nepotism and discrimination, offering them opportunities to build careers based on competence rather than family connections. The implication had been crystal clear. Clarke Industries wasn't just terminating their relationship with Meridian. They were positioning themselves as a direct competitor with resources that would make competition impossible. Madison Clarke, the employee Richard had discarded as expendable, was about to become the leader of a marketing firm with corporate backing that could poach Meridian's best talent, steal their remaining clients, and drive them out of business within months. Furthermore, Catherine had continued, delivering the final stroke that would complete Meridian's destruction. Clarke Industries will be informing all of our business partners about Meridian's employment practices and their termination of our family member for demonstrating superior competence. Companies that value ethical partnerships will be advised to consider alternative marketing firms that align with their commitment to merit-based advancement. The corporate death sentence had been delivered with surgical precision, each element designed to systematically eliminate Meridian's ability to survive in a competitive marketplace. Loss of their biggest client, massive financial liability for contract breach, federal investigation of employment practices, direct competition from a better-funded rival, and systematic exclusion from the business relationships that made sustainable operations possible. Richard had aged visibly during the conversation, his face taking on the gray pallor of someone who understood that his life's work was being destroyed by consequences he'd never anticipated. Victoria had been crying silently, mascara creating dark tracks down her cheeks as she'd finally grasped that her stolen promotion had triggered a chain of events that would eliminate not just her career, but her father's entire business legacy. "Please," Richard had said, his voice breaking with genuine desperation as he'd made one final attempt to negotiate some kind of mercy from forces he'd never understood existed. Madison is obviously a remarkable young woman, and our handling of her termination was clearly inadequate. What would Clarke Industries require for us to resolve this situation and move forward? But Catherine's expression had remained implacable, carrying the determination of someone implementing a strategy that had been developed over decades of careful planning. Mr. Ashford, Helena Clarke spent 70 years building protections against exactly the kind of discrimination Madison experienced here. Those protections aren't negotiable, and they're certainly not subject to settlement discussions with people who've demonstrated that they consider merit less important than family privilege. The meeting had concluded with Catherine providing Richard with contact information for the legal team that would be handling all future communications between Clarke Industries and Meridian Marketing Group. No further direct discussions would be possible. Everything would proceed through attorneys who specialized in corporate dissolution and employment discrimination litigation. As we'd left Meridian's offices for the final time, Victoria had followed us to the elevator, her professional composure completely shattered as she'd made one last desperate attempt to minimize the consequences of her actions. "Madison, please, I never meant for any of this to happen. I thought we were friends. If I'd known about your family situation, I never would have accepted the Phoenix account." I'd looked at her with something approaching pity, recognizing that she still didn't understand that the problem wasn't her ignorance about my family connections, but her willingness to steal credit for work she'd never done, and then orchestrate the removal of someone whose competence threatened her advancement. "Victoria, you didn't destroy your career because you didn't know who my family was. You destroyed it because you thought merit was less important than privilege, and you were willing to eliminate anyone who proved you were wrong." 6 months later, I'd been sitting in my new corner office at Clarke Marketing Solutions, reviewing quarterly reports that demonstrated exactly how completely Catherine's strategy had succeeded in dismantling Meridian's business. Phoenix Dynamics had become our anchor client, and Dr. Chen had personally recommended us to 12 other renewable energy companies who'd been impressed by our technical expertise and ethical business practices. Our employee roster included 7 former Meridian executives who'd been eager to join a firm that promoted based on competence rather than family connections. Meridian Marketing Group had filed for bankruptcy protection after losing 60% of their client base within 4 months. The federal investigation into their employment practices had resulted in settlements with 11 former employees who'd experienced discrimination similar to mine, and Richard Ashford had been personally named in a class action lawsuit that had destroyed both his business and his personal finances. Victoria had been unable to find employment with any reputable marketing firm, her reputation so thoroughly destroyed by the Phoenix disaster that her resume generated automatic rejections from companies throughout the region. The local business journal had featured Clarke Marketing Solutions on their cover, with a headline that read, "Merit over Nepotism, How Ethical Leadership Drives Success." The article had detailed our rapid growth and our commitment to hiring based on qualifications rather than family connections, positioning us as the alternative for companies that wanted to partner with organizations that shared their values. But perhaps the most satisfying development had been the letter I'd received from Dr. Chen, expressing gratitude for the marketing strategies that had helped Phoenix Dynamics exceed their expansion goals by 40% ahead of schedule. "Working with Clarke Marketing Solutions has been transformative for our business," she'd written. "Your team's combination of technical expertise and strategic innovation demonstrates exactly why competence should always be the primary criterion for professional advancement." The woman who'd been humiliated and discarded from Meridian for threatening someone's unearned privilege had become the leader of a marketing empire that operated according to principles that her grandmother had spent decades developing. Merit mattered more than connections, competence was valued above family names, and ethical business practices created sustainable success that nepotism could never achieve. Richard and Victoria Ashford had learned that some victories come with consequences that destroy everything you thought you'd won, and that underestimating someone based on assumptions about their resources and connections could be the most expensive mistake of a lifetime. The Phoenix account they'd stolen had become the instrument of their complete professional destruction, and the employee they'd discarded had revealed herself to be connected to power they'd never imagined existed. Helena Clarke's vision of protecting family members from institutional discrimination had been validated in the most decisive way possible, and the accountability network she'd spent 70 years building had demonstrated exactly why ethical business practices weren't just moral imperatives, but practical necessities for long-term success. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.